Hospital guards refused the grizzled veteran entry to ICU until the surgeons saw his Navy cross and stopped. The automatic doors of St. Mary's General Hospital slid open with a mechanical whisper as Frank Morrison stepped into the sterile brightness of the emergency lobby. His weathered face, marked by decades of sun and hardship, surveyed the bustling scene before him. At 73, Frank carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much but never complained about it. His faded flannel shirt, worn work boots, and the slight tremor in his left hand told a story that most people never bothered to read. The night shift had just begun, and the hospital hummed with controlled chaos. Nurses moved between patients with practiced efficiency, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made everyone look tired, but Frank's eyes held a different kind of weariness, one that came from carrying invisible wounds for half a century. He approached the information desk, where a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a name tag reading Jessica looked up from her computer screen. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she took in his appearance, her smile becoming more professional than warm. "Can I help you?" Jessica asked, her tone suggesting she hoped this would be quick. "I'm here to see Tommy Richardson. He was brought in about 2 hours ago." "Car accident," Frank said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who had spent years shouting orders over helicopter rotors and artillery fire. Jessica's fingers danced across the keyboard, her manicured nails clicking against the keys. "Are you family?" "Not blood family, no," Frank replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "But that boy's been like a son to me for 20 years. His parents died when he was 12, and I'm sorry, sir," Jessica interrupted, her voice taking on that particular tone of bureaucratic finality. "ICU visiting is restricted to immediate family only. Hospital policy." Before continue, give this video a like and subscribe to discover more stories of heroes whose battles aren't always visible in their uniforms. Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had faced down enemy fire in the jungles of Vietnam, survived 3 tours of duty, and earned more medals than he cared to remember. But he had never learned how to navigate the sterile battlefields of modern bureaucracy. "Ma'am, I understand you have rules," he began, his voice remaining steady despite the frustration building in his chest. "But Tommy doesn't have anyone else. No siblings, no aunts or uncles. I've been to every one of his baseball games, helped him through high school, taught him how to change a tire, how to tie a tie for prom. If that doesn't make me family." "Sir, I really am sorry," Jessica said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I can't make exceptions. You're welcome to wait in the general waiting area, and I can have someone update you when there's news." Frank nodded slowly, recognizing the futility of arguing with someone who wielded policy like a shield. He had encountered this type before, people who confused following rules with doing what was right. In the military, he had learned when to push and when to find another way forward. He made his way to the waiting area, a collection of uncomfortable chairs arranged around a television that flickered with the night's news. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee, punctuated by the occasional announcement over the intercom calling for doctors to various wards. As Frank settled into a chair that had seen better decades, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a younger version of himself standing next to a 12-year-old boy with sandy hair and a gap-toothed grin. Tommy Richardson, the kid who had shown up at his door one rainy evening, soaked to the bone and carrying a backpack containing everything he owned. The other people in the waiting room gave him curious glances before returning to their own worries. To them, he was just another old man in threadbare clothes, someone easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. They couldn't see the citations for valor, the Purple Hearts, or the Navy Cross that represented the highest honor the service could bestow upon someone who had repeatedly thrown himself into harm's way to save others. 2 security guards approached Frank as he sat in the waiting room, their presence commanding attention from the other visitors. The larger of the 2, A man whose uniform strained against his substantial frame wore a name tag reading Mitchell. His partner, younger and leaner, kept his hand resting casually near his radio. "Sir, we need to ask you to move along," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Visiting hours are over, and you're not authorized to be in this section of the hospital." Frank looked up from the photograph he had been studying, his eyes meeting Mitchell's with the steady gaze of someone who had stared down far more intimidating opponents. "I'm not causing any trouble, just waiting for word on Tommy Richardson in the ICU." "The desk clerk already told you," the younger guard interjected, his tone sharper than necessary. "Family only. You need to leave." "I'll wait outside then," Frank replied, beginning to stand. The movement sent a sharp pain through his left leg, a reminder of shrapnel that had never been completely removed. He steadied himself against the chair, the brief grimace of pain not going unnoticed by the guards. "Look, old-timer," Mitchell said, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made Frank's hands clench into fists. "This isn't a homeless shelter. You can't just camp out here because you've got nowhere else to go." The assumption hit Frank like a physical blow. In their eyes, his worn clothing and weathered appearance marked him as derelict, someone to be moved along like a piece of inconvenient furniture. They saw only what they expected to see, an old man down on his luck, probably looking for a warm place to spend the night. "I'm not homeless," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made both guards take notice. "I have a home, and I have a reason to be here. That young man upstairs saved my life once, and I'm not leaving until I know he's okay." Mitchell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Right. And I'm sure you've got some sob story about being war buddies or something. Look, we get it. Everyone's got a story, but stories don't change hospital policy." Frank reached into his jacket, a movement that made the younger guard tense and step forward. From his wallet, Frank pulled out a folded piece of paper, a letter written on lined notebook paper in a child's careful handwriting. "20 years ago," Frank began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "a 12-year-old kid knocked on my door during a thunderstorm. He was soaking wet, scared out of his mind, and had just lost both parents in a car crash. Social services was going to put him in the system, but somehow he'd gotten my address." He unfolded the letter, its creases worn soft from years of handling. "He'd written me this letter in school for a Veterans Day project. His teacher had given the class my name as someone who lived alone and might appreciate hearing from a student. In this letter, he thanked me for my service and asked if I ever got lonely." Mitchell's expression softened slightly, but his stance remained firm. "That's a nice story, but..." "The night he showed up at my door," Frank continued, "he told me he remembered writing to the old soldier who lived by himself. He said maybe we could be lonely together instead of apart. I became his legal guardian 6 months later." The younger guard shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we understand this is emotional for you, but rules are rules. We can't have people camping out in the hospital just because they claim to know someone." Frank carefully folded the letter and returned it to his wallet. The dismissive tone, the word claim, the assumption that he was lying or exaggerating, it all crystallized into something harder than anger. It was disappointment in a system that had forgotten how to see past appearances, how to recognize that sometimes the most important relationships weren't defined by blood or legal documents, but by choice and commitment. "I'll wait outside," he said finally, recognizing that this particular battle couldn't be won with words. Dr. Sarah Chen had been on her feet for 14 hours straight, moving between surgery and the ICU with the relentless efficiency that had made her one of the most respected trauma surgeons at St. Mary's. At 38, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who made life-and-death decisions daily, but tonight felt different. The weight of responsibility seemed heavier somehow. She emerged from the operating room after successfully repairing Tommy Richardson's internal injuries, pulling off her surgical mask as she walked toward the ICU. The young man would live, though recovery would take time. As she made her way down the corridor, she noticed a commotion near the main entrance. Through the large windows, she could see an elderly man sitting on a bench outside the hospital's main entrance. Even from a distance, she could tell he was upset. Two security guards stood nearby, clearly having just escorted him out. Something about the scene troubled her. "What's going on?" she asked Jessica at the information desk. "Just some old guy claiming to be family to the Richardson patient," Jessica replied with a dismissive wave. "He was getting pretty insistent, so security asked him to leave. You know how it is with these types." Dr. Chen frowned. "These types are homeless, probably, looking for a warm place to spend the night, making up stories about knowing patients. We get them sometimes." Something in Jessica's casual dismissal bothered Dr. Chen. She had learned, through years of emergency medicine, that assumptions could be dangerous. She had seen wealthy executives collapse from heart attacks while looking perfectly healthy, and had treated homeless veterans whose injuries told stories of heroism that their appearance never suggested. "Did he say anything specific about the patient?" Jessica shrugged. "Some story about raising him, teaching him to drive, baseball games, generic stuff anyone could make up." Dr. Chen walked to the window and studied the man on the bench. He sat with military posture despite his obvious distress, his hands folded in his lap in a way that suggested discipline and patience. Something about his bearing reminded her of her own grandfather, a World War II veteran who had carried himself with similar quiet dignity until the day he died. "I'm going to talk to him," she decided. "Dr. Chen, really, it's not necessary. Security handled it." But Dr. Chen was already pushing through the doors into the cool night air. The man looked up as she approached, and she was struck by his eyes, clear blue and alert, not the clouded gaze she might expect from someone struggling with mental health or substance abuse issues. "Excuse me," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. "I'm Dr. Chen. I just finished operating on Tommy Richardson." Frank's entire body tensed with attention. "Is he going to be okay?" The genuine concern in his voice, the way he leaned forward with desperate hope, told Dr. Chen everything she needed to know about the relationship between this man and her patient. "He's going to recover," she said gently. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's stable now. Can you tell me about Tommy? Sometimes personal information helps us understand our patients better." Frank's relief was palpable. He closed his eyes for a moment, and Dr. Chen saw his lips move in what might have been a prayer of gratitude. "Tommy's a mechanic," Frank began, his voice stronger now. "Works at Patterson's auto shop downtown. He's been saving money to go back to school, wants to be an engineer. Smart as a whip, that kid. Never missed a day of work in 5 years." Dr. Chen listened as Frank painted a picture of a young man she hadn't expected, responsible, ambitious, deeply connected to the community through his work and volunteer coaching at the local youth center. "He volunteers every Saturday morning," Frank continued, "teaching kids basic car maintenance. Says everyone should know how to change a tire and check their oil. He learned that from me." "And you are?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Frank was quiet for a moment. "I'm the man who raised him after his parents died. Not legally, I suppose, after he turned 18, but you don't stop being someone's father just because the paperwork says so." Dr. Chen found herself genuinely moved by Frank's obvious devotion to Tommy, but she needed to understand more about this man who had been dismissed so readily by her staff. "How did you come to raise Tommy?" she asked. Frank smiled for the first time since she'd met him, the expression transforming his weathered features. "That's a story that goes back to when I was trying to figure out what to do with myself after the war. I'd come home from Vietnam in '71 and nothing felt right anymore. Couldn't hold down a job, couldn't relate to people who hadn't been where I'd been." He paused, looking out at the parking lot where a few late-night visitors were making their way to and from their cars. "I was living alone in this little house I'd inherited from my father, pretty much keeping to myself. Then one day, this teacher from the elementary school calls me up. Says she's got a class doing a Veterans Day project, and would I mind if one of her students wrote me a letter. Dr. Chen found herself drawn into the story, impressed by Frank's articulate manner of speaking and the clear love in his voice when he talked about Tommy. "So this kid writes me this letter," Frank continued, reaching into his wallet to show her the worn piece of paper she'd heard about earlier. "Thanked me for my service, asked about what it was like being a soldier, told me about his family. But what got me was the last line. He asked if I ever got lonely living by myself." Dr. Chen read the letter, noting the careful penmanship and the genuine curiosity in the child's questions. "He sounds like he was a thoughtful kid." "The most thoughtful kid you'd ever meet," Frank agreed. "I wrote him back, told him about some of the places I'd been, some of the good things I'd seen along with the bad. We kept writing back and forth for months. His teacher said it was the best project she'd ever seen. Tommy was asking all kinds of questions about geography and history, looking up places I'd mentioned." Frank's expression grew more serious. "Then one night, during a bad thunderstorm, there's this knock at my door. I open it, and there's Tommy, 12 years old, soaking wet, carrying everything he owned in a backpack. His parents had been killed in a car accident that afternoon, and somehow he'd convinced a social worker to let him call me." Dr. Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What did you do?" "What anyone would do," Frank said simply. "I brought him inside, got him dry clothes, made him something to eat. He was in shock, obviously, barely speaking. But he stayed close to me all night, like he was afraid I might disappear too." "And you became his guardian?" Frank nodded. "Took 6 months to get through all the paperwork, but yes, best decision I ever made. That boy saved my life as much as I saved his." Dr. Chen was beginning to understand why Tommy had never mentioned Frank to the hospital staff, not out of embarrassment or distance, but because the relationship was so fundamental to who he was that it didn't occur to him to explain it. Frank wasn't his guardian or adoptive father in any official sense. He was simply his dad. "Frank," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense. My staff assumed you were homeless. I can see that's not true, but I'm curious why they would make that assumption." Frank looked down at his clothes, the faded flannel shirt, the work boots that had seen better years, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of age and old injuries. "I suppose I don't look like much," he admitted. "Never cared much about appearances. After the war, after Tommy grew up and moved out, I just got into the habit of keeping things simple." He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small leather case. Inside, Dr. Chen could see the unmistakable blue ribbon and bronze star of what looked like a significant military decoration. "Is that Navy Cross?" Frank said quietly. "For actions above and beyond the call of duty during the Tet Offensive in 1968. Dr. Chen stared at the Navy Cross, understanding immediately the magnitude of what she was looking at. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration that could be awarded to a member of the U.S. Navy, and she knew enough military history to understand that receiving one meant Frank had performed acts of extraordinary heroism under fire. "Frank," she said softly, "may I ask what you did to earn this?" Frank closed the case gently, his fingers tracing the worn leather. "My unit was pinned down by enemy fire for 3 days. We had wounded men who couldn't be evacuated, and we were running out of medical supplies. The medic had been killed on the first day." He spoke in the matter-of-fact tone that Dr. Chen recognized from other veterans she had treated, men and women who discussed acts of incredible bravery as if they were mundane occurrences. "I made 4 trips across open ground under heavy fire to get medical supplies from a crashed helicopter about 200 yards from our position. On the 4th trip, I carried back a wounded Marine who couldn't walk." The citation says, "I saved 6 lives that day." Dr. Chen felt a mixture of awe and anger, awe at Frank's heroism, and anger at how he had been treated by her staff. "Frank, why didn't you tell the security guards about your military service?" Frank looked at her with surprise. "Why would I? That was 50 years ago, and it doesn't have anything to do with why I needed to see Tommy." His response revealed something profound about his character. For Frank, his military honors were not credentials to be wielded for advantage, but simply part of his past. He had never considered using his status as a decorated veteran to gain access to Tommy because, in his mind, his right to be there came from 20 years of being a father, not from medals earned in a war decades ago. "Would you like to see Tommy now?" Dr. Chen asked, standing up from the bench. "Can I? I thought the rules." "I'm the attending physician," Dr. Chen said firmly, "and I'm making a medical determination that Tommy's recovery will be enhanced by the presence of his primary support system." As they walked back into the hospital together, Dr. Chen found herself reflecting on the assumptions that had led to this situation. Jessica at the information desk had seen an old man in worn clothes and assumed he was homeless. The security guards had seen someone who didn't fit their image of a hospital visitor and assumed he was lying about his connection to a patient. But Dr. Chen had seen something different, the bearing of someone accustomed to command, the articulate speech of an educated man, the genuine concern of a parent for his child. Most importantly, she had taken the time to look beyond appearances and listen to his story. They took the elevator to the ICU, where Tommy lay unconscious but stable, connected to various monitors that beeped softly in the quiet room. Frank approached the bedside with the careful movements of someone who had spent time in hospitals before, understanding instinctively not to disturb the equipment. "Hey there, son," Frank said softly, taking Tommy's hand in his own weathered fingers. "You gave me quite a scare." Dr. Chen watched from the doorway as this gruff, unassuming man transformed into the gentle father figure that Tommy had needed all these years. She thought about the series of small failures that had nearly prevented this reunion, the quick judgments, the rigid adherence to policy without consideration for individual circumstances, the tendency to dismiss people who didn't fit expected patterns. As she prepared to leave them alone, Frank turned to her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, doctor, not just for saving his life, but for seeing past what everyone else saw." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding that she had learned something as valuable as any medical technique.